In the winter of 1940-4, the Ardennes Forest in Belgium was covered in a thick layer of snow, the cold wind carrying the smell of gunpowder through the bare trees. An unprecedented storm of steel was brewing. A German sergeant slowly emerged from the depths of the jungle, his uniform already torn to shreds, blackened by artillery fire. His hands raised high above his head. Behind him lay a landscape as desolate as the surface of the moon, plowed over and over again by American shells. Charred tank wreckage still smoking, the sky so dim that one could not tell whether it was dawn or dusk. This German sergeant was lucky. He had survived this sudden war. When American soldiers surrounded him and took him prisoner, he said something, words that American forces would hear repeatedly from countless German POWs in the months that followed. They could not escape the artillery. The sky was almost entirely dominated by American firepower. These captured German soldiers did not know they were about to be sent to a secret base hidden on American soil. Their recording equipment would capture every conversation they had with other prisoners. These recordings were classified as top secret and sealed for over 50 years. It was not until the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, that these long, sealed recordings finally saw the light of day, revealing to the world that deliberately hidden history. These classified recordings, whether battle-hardened veterans from the brutal Eastern Front or young recruits who had just picked up a rifle, they were all repeating the same thing. This was the true feeling of fighting against the American military. This is not just a military history, but a profound record of human nature, fear, and awakening. Next, let us enter the hidden world of German POWs, decode the deeper meaning behind these words, and reveal the truth about the American way of war that these unknown private conversations exposed. During World War II, the German Wehrmacht was widely recognized as one of the most formidable military forces in history. In September 1930-9, the German army launched a blitzkrieg against Poland, forcing a nation with a million-strong army to surrender in just 20-7 days, shocking the entire world. Then, in the long and brutal bloodbath of the Eastern Front, the German military demonstrated terrifying combat power. Capturing 660,000 Soviet troops in a single encirclement at Kiev, setting a record for the largest encirclement battle in military history. Military academies around the world studied German tactics. From Rommel's Desert Blitz to Guderian's armored breakthroughs, every German victory became a textbook classic. In 1940, German armored forces launched a surprise attack on France, forcing the country with Europe's strongest army to surrender in just 6 weeks, completely rewriting the rules of mechanized armored warfare. Many military historians assess that in terms of individual soldier quality, German tactical flexibility far surpassed their opponents, and the fire coordination capability of a single German infantry squad could even rival that of an allied platoon. German military leaders repeatedly mocked and publicly belittled American industrial power, arrogantly declaring that Americans only knew how to make razor blades and had no understanding of real war. In their view, America was nothing more than an upstart that only knew how to make cars and chewing gum, incomparable to the German warriors forged in the Prussian military tradition. German officers clinked glasses at dinner tables, often using the American military as a joke, believing that those young men from New York and Texas would only run away on the battlefield. In February 1940-3, this prejudice seemed to be confirmed. General Rommel led German forces in a devastating strike against the American military at the Battle of Kayai de Sereni Pass in Tunisia. American lines completely collapsed. Soldiers fled in panic. Officers completely lost command capability. Massive amounts of equipment were abandoned along the retreat route. The entire battlefield turned into a disorderly rout. Over 6,000 Americans were killed. Hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Rommel wrote in his battle report that American forces lacked combat experience and had completely lost their judgment on the chaotic battlefield. They did not even know how to organize an effective defense. After the battle, German soldiers scavenged the bodies of fallen Americans, stealing boots, socks, and jackets in a gruesome scene. American commander Omar Bradley witnessed this firsthand and could never forget. This disastrous defeat became the darkest page in American military history, but it also marked the starting point of a shift in German perceptions of the American military. The Americans quickly learned from the KAS Serenity Pass debacle, completing a remarkable tactical reform in just a few months. General Bradley thoroughly reorganized and retrained his forces. While the Germans remained blissfully unaware that they were about to face a very different opponent. However, after KAS Serenity Pass, everything began to change. German contempt for the American military gradually faded over the course of the war, replaced by a deeper emotion. The Germans had once believed their war machine was invincible, but facing the Americans, this myth quickly shattered. This change did not stem from recognition of American infantry tactics. Throughout the war, the Germans always considered American infantry tactics crude, lacking the exquisite battlefield intuition and flexible adaptability that German forces possessed. Instead, it was a deep fear of the American military. This fear had nothing to do with American individual combat capability, but rather the devastating firepower that American forces could unleash in an instant. That torrent of steel pouring in from the horizon, that suffocating fire suppression. The American military could complete a battle without relying on infantry charges. They could forcefully break through any defensive line with overwhelming firepower, grinding all resistance to dust. That is right, American infantry was not invincible. But the American war machine was something no opponent could match. In the summer of 1940-2, the American military urgently established a special base in Virginia. Located near Washington at Fort Hunt, from the outside it appeared to be just an ordinary military facility. But its true purpose went far beyond that. Fort Hunt was a secret intelligence listening station specifically designed for holding and interrogating German POWs. The entire base operation was a model of intelligence warfare. German POWs were placed in seemingly ordinary barracks, not knowing that microphones were hidden behind every wall, bugs were buried under every table, and listening devices were even concealed in the garden shrubbery. The Americans also specifically arranged German-speaking intelligence officers to pose as barracks administrators and logistics personnel, having daily contact with the POWs, casually guiding conversations to obtain key information. American intelligence personnel monitored and recorded every whisper of the POWs day and night, piecing together valuable military intelligence from fragments of their casual conversations. From 1940- to 1940-5, the Fort Hunt monitoring team accumulated over 150,000 pages of recording transcripts. These precious first-hand materials were not declassified until the 1990s, revealing the most genuine thoughts deep within the German POWs' hearts, secrets they would never have admitted in public. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Britain, another similar listening base was also in operation. Trent Park, a Victorian-era estate in London's northern suburbs, was transformed by British intelligence into a comfortable confinement facility specifically for captured German senior generals. The listening targets here were not ordinary soldiers, but captured German generals, lieutenant generals, and staff officers. The British provided these generals with extremely comfortable living conditions, fine meals, premium wine, elegant garden walks. Allowing them to completely let down their guard, they candidly analyzed the war situation in a relaxed environment without any precautions, while hidden recording equipment faithfully captured everything. These generals could never have imagined that what they thought were private conversations were actually being recorded word for word. The Fort Hunt monitoring records revealed a clear trajectory of change. In the early stages of the war, German POWs were full of contempt for the American military. They mocked the way American soldiers fought, believing that Americans only knew how to hide behind artillery fire and dared not engage in direct combat. A captured German captain said dismissively in a private conversation that American soldiers could not even hold their rifles steady. Without those overwhelming shells, they would never dare to set foot on the battlefield. They only knew how to use steel to compensate for their lack of courage. However, as the war progressed, this contempt gradually gave way to fear. After the Normandy landings, the tone of German POWs underwent a fundamental shift. They no longer mocked American fighting spirit, but instead began describing the experience of fighting the Americans in an almost desperate tone. A German sergeant captured in the Falaise pocket told his companion in the barracks that you could not see American soldiers at all, you could only see artillery shells. From morning to night, shells fell like rain, you could not even lift your head. By the time you finally could look up, their tanks were already right in front of you. Another POW added that the most terrifying thing was not the shells themselves, but the shelling would never stop. Your position was leveled, you thought it was over, but half an hour later, another round of bombardment began. You did not know when it would end. This waiting was more crushing than the shells themselves. The horror of American artillery lay not only in its firepower density, but also in its precision and response speed. German POWs repeatedly mentioned a detail that made their hair stand on end: the American artillery observers. These observers circled the battlefield in small aircraft, and once they spotted German positions, they immediately called in artillery fire via radio. From target discovery to shells landing off and took only a few minutes. A German major said helplessly in a Fort Hunt recording that they did not even need to look at our carefully constructed defensive positions. A small plane flew over, and minutes later everything was reduced to ruins. No matter how brilliant our tactics were, they were meaningless against absolute firepower. Another captured German artillery officer lamented that American fire coordination was as precise as a clock. Their observers were in the air, the front lines had radios, and the rear had gun batteries, the three working together seamlessly. We were still using signal flags and couriers. This gap could not be bridged by courage. What made German POWs even more desperate was American air power. From 1940 onward, Allied air superiority had been overwhelmingly established. German POWs described how daytime marches were nearly impossible, as American fighter-bombers could appear in the sky at any moment. A German corporal captured during the Battle of the Bulge recalled that they could only march at night, as any moving object during the day became a target. Their planes were everywhere. You had nowhere to hide. The most terrifying thing was the sound of dive bombing, like the scream of death. When you heard that sound, it was already too late. Sometimes a truck had just pulled out of the woods and was blown to pieces before even reaching the road. They even started to dread clear days, because clear weather meant their planes would definitely come. Another POW mentioned an unforgettable scene. During a march, American fighters suddenly appeared and strafed the entire convoy. He watched helplessly as the comrade beside him was struck by bullets and fell. While those planes seemed to be playing a game, casually circling, diving, shooting, and then flying away, leaving craters and screams across the ground. Beyond firepower and their superiority, what German POWs found most incredible about the American military was their logistical supply capability. During World War II, more than half of the German military logistics still relied on horses, maintaining millions of military horses throughout the war, while the American military had 0 horses, achieving full mechanization. This fully mechanized logistics model was completely incomprehensible to German forces that had long been mired in the Eastern Front mud, barely moving because horse-drawn carriages were too slow on muddy roads. A German logistics officer was overheard saying that one German division needed 3,000 horses to maintain its supply line, while the Americans only needed trucks. They had more trucks than we had horses. This was simply not an equal war. After being held in American POW camps, the clean barracks, regular meals, and abundant supplies completely overturned German perceptions. Ice cream and Coke minus cola were actually standard daily items. Food standards for ordinary American soldiers far exceeded those of frontline German troops, even surpassing what German officers received. The POW camps had hot showers, clean bedding, regularly replaced uniforms, and even libraries and sports facilities. At first, the POWs thought this was a deliberate propaganda show, something the Americans were putting on for them. Later, they realized that this was simply the norm for the American military, the daily operation of an industrial powerhouse. One POW remarked in a private conversation that if their POW camps had better conditions than their own front lines, then this war should never have been fought from the start. POW Herbert Tess, CHBA recalled in an oral interview decades later that after witnessing American supply reserves firsthand, he finally woke up. Germany never had a chance of winning from the very beginning. Victory or defeat was not about tactics or weapons. It was about comprehensive national power. The American homeland had never been bombed, never been blockaded by sea. Its complete industrial system had not been consumed by war. Factories worked around the clock producing tanks, planes, and artillery, weapons coming off assembly lines faster than they could be consumed at the front. This was a gap that a Germany exhausted by 4 years of total war could not match, an abyss-like chasm that could never be crossed. The Trent Park monitoring records in Britain supplemented the strategic perspective that the American base had not captured. German senior generals held in comfortable confinement candidly analyzed the war situation, their conversations lacking the fear and despair of ordinary soldiers. Replaced instead by a common sober strategic judgment by the end of 1940-2, and especially after 1940-3, all the high-ranking officers knew that this war was strategically doomed to fail. They still recognized German individual combat capability, but understood that war was about resources and national power. No matter the outcome of individual battles, Germany was already incapable of sustaining a prolonged total war. In May 1940-3, after the fall of Tunisia, a captured German general privately admitted that the Americans were not yet mature fighters, but they would grow quickly. Backed by terrifying industrial and material strength, German defeat was a foregone conclusion. This prediction ultimately proved entirely accurate. From the Sicily landings to the Normandy beaches, from the Falaise pocket to the Ardennes counteroffensive, the American military demonstrated increasingly powerful combat capability in every major battle. Although German forces could still achieve tactical victories in local battles, these victories increasingly resembled the last struggles of a drowning man, unable to change the overall trajectory of the war toward defeat. Military historian Trevor Dupuy's statistical analysis of European battlefield data found that under equal combat conditions, German ground forces consistently maintained a better casualty exchange ratio than American and British forces. In terms of individual tactics and small unit combat capability, German proficiency was indeed superior, but the outcome of war was never determined by individual soldier quality. Historian Max Hastings resolved this contradiction in his 2004 book Armageddon. Measured by traditional tactical standards, German individual combat power was indeed stronger than that of American and British forces, but he simultaneously pointed out a crucial distinction. If American and British soldiers were to emulate German brutality or Soviet fearlessness in the face of death, it would be equivalent to abandoning democratic principles and descending into tyranny and barbarism. American soldiers were not killing machines fanatically dying for an extreme ideology. They were simply ordinary citizens in uniform, young people from farms and factories, whose only desire was to win the war, return home safely, and resume their ordinary lives. Therefore, the American military habitually used firepower advantages to reduce casualties. This was not cowardice, but rather reverence for life, including the lives of their own soldiers. An army that cherishes life actually possesses more enduring fighting power. The recordings from both the American and British bases also revealed deeper reflections on human nature and morality. German officers privately discussed the atrocities committed on the Eastern Front, confronting the truth of the Holocaust. Some were haunted by fear, Unable to sleep at night, others were oddly numb, having lost the ability to feel pain. They gradually awakened to the realization that they served an unprecedented evil regime, and that the war of aggression they fought for was destined to be destroyed. A German lieutenant general admitted at Trent Park in a private conversation that when they talked about what happened on the Eastern Front, everyone knew what it was, but no one dared to say it out loud. They had participated in those crimes, or at least tacitly allowed them to exist. Now that they had lost, this was perhaps a just punishment. Another captured German major general whispered in a late-night conversation that they thought they were fighting for their homeland, but in reality they were only sacrificing their lives for a madman's ambition. Those who died on the Eastern Front, they were not heroes. They were just victims. This is also the ultimate answer from German POWs about the American military. They feared the artillery, the air raids, and the crushing weight of material superiority. But the deeper realization hidden in their hearts was even more devastating, that they fought for an unjust cause and were ultimately defeated by the very civilization they had helped to destroy. Democracy, rule of law, human dignity, these values trampled by the Nazis, were precisely the source of power that defeated them. The last surviving witnesses of World War II are gradually passing away. The Fort Hunt veterans who returned to the camp for reunions in the early 21st century, the German POWs, whom marveled at American supplies, have all passed on. Only the 150,000 pages of recording transcripts remain in the archives, recording the private voices of that vanished era. Every sentence something the participants never wanted the world to know. These recordings are not just military historical materials, but a mirror reflecting both the darkness and brilliance of human nature. Today, when scholars pore over these archives, tens of thousands of conversations repeatedly confirm the same fact. The roaring American heavy artillery, the aircraft formations blocking out the sun, the supply envoys that kept growing in number, constituted an inescapable nightmare of war for the Germans. These voices have traversed 80 years of time, still reminding the world today that the cruelty of war exceeds imagination, and the preciousness of peace must be remembered. In December 1940-4, that German sergeant who walked out of the Belgian jungle with his hands raised was eventually sent to a POW camp on American soil. There, he tasted ice cream for the first time, slept in a clean bed for the first time, and fell asleep in a quiet environment for the first time without worrying about the whistling of artillery shells. The archives did not record his name, nor his fate after the war. But through the voices of thousands of comrades, we understand his whispered words about artillery fire in the sky. The American military fought with machines and national power, not merely with manpower. The small walkie-talkie was a weapon that rewrote the rules of the battlefield. German POWs repeatedly mentioned in the recordings a weapon that left them feeling utterly powerless, the walkie-talkie carried by American infantry. This seemingly insignificant small radio device allowed American infantry platoons to call in artillery support and air strikes at any time. A captured German company commander said in despair in a Fort Hunt recording that when a German company commander needed to request artillery support, it had to go through battalion and regiment headquarters layer by layer, and by the time shells landed, the position might already be lost. But an American platoon leader could just pick up the walkie-talkie and shout, and minutes later shells would land precisely on your head. This efficiency gap was suffocating. No matter how tenacious the German forces were, they could not withstand the full suppression of the steel torrent. A German veteran monitored at Fort Hunt ultimately concluded that they had not lost to a group of soldiers, but to a factory. Every shell, every tank, every plane of theirs was a product of the industrial assembly line. They used flesh and blood to fight machines, and were doomed to fail from the very beginning. The warmth and fullness after capture, the stable barracks, the peace far from the flames of war, allowed countless Germans to finally see through the lies of Nazi propaganda. America was never a corrupt weakling. Fighting the American military meant fighting not just an army, but an entire powerful industrial and logistical system. Instantly arriving firepower, continuous bombing, endless supplies, left the German forces disoriented, when the opponent could use steel and explosives to completely cover the battlefield from beyond visual range. No amount of top-steer tactics or fearless courage could turn the tide. This is the American way of war. The core of this warfare method is not trading lives for victory, but using industrial power to crush all resistance. When industrial power combines with democratic conviction, the energy it releases is something no military power can withstand. The recordings of German POWs tell us an eternal truth. The outcome of war is never decided on the battlefield, but in factories and in the convictions of the people. Whether the Germans hated or revered it, whether veterans survived by luck or were buried in foreign fields, everyone knew in their hearts that the outcome of this war had long been decided. History does not repeat, but it often rhymes. Those voices sealed in recording tapes are the most profound warning to future generations. When power attempts to conquer the world by force, it will ultimately be defeated by a stronger civilization force. This is a truth that history has repeatedly proven. May the souls of those who lost their lives in the flames of war rest in peace, and may such tragedies never happen again. Let us remember history, cherish peace, and protect the hard-won freedom and dignity. Only in this way will those lost lives not have been sacrificed in vain, and those unforgettable lessons will forever illuminate the path forward for humanity, guiding us toward a brighter future. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's most pivotal moments and the hidden stories behind them, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for weekly deep dives into the past that shaped our world. I am your history observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield of knowledge. Until then, remember that the past is never truly past. It lives on in the choices we make today.